Okay, live and recording. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to Language 23,000 Conversational Klingon. This is Lecture 1, Patak and Other Insults. Hope you've been listening along with our audiobook, Conversational Klingon, presented by Worf himself, Mr. Michael Dorn. I'm never going to get tired of doing these fake class name jokes, by the way. I plan to do one for every lecture, so get ready for those. Coming next is, all right, so this is really Philosophy 2600, Ethics in Science. Welcome to Lecture 1, Course Themes Continued. I'm, of course, joined by my two dogs, one of whom is sitting directly behind me. The other one's right over there. Say hi, Lou. Can you guys see him, actually? There he is. Okay, there he is. Now you can see him. Yeah, what we're going to do today is continue on our discussion of course themes, and there's some stuff that I want to highlight from our readings. Let's get into it. So this is from last week, and so is the next slide. Why study ethics in science? Well, a couple reasons. Like we've talked about, science is not neutral. And really nothing is ethically or morally neutral, right? And we kind of know this intuitively. Everything we do has some effect on the world and on ourselves. And so even looking at, in the Brigham and Mitchum reading, the story of the Manhattan Project, or in our other readings, everything going on with, say, these government projects that have come to light recently, like MK Ultra and Operation Paperclip, there are ethical stakes there. And what we do affects things. Science is not done in a vacuum. As nice as it is to say that science is morally neutral and always good, it's not. There's a lot of bad science out there. And there's still many unresolved questions. And a lot of those unresolved questions are things that I think are going to come up a lot in future lectures. Then there's also these 7 overlapping trends. And I think you'll notice that we hit all of these as time goes on. The increasing power of science. It has a huge effect on our lives. And that's, if this is the case, then I have some questions, which is what happens for life in a free and democratic society for all of us, right? Because we have a shared responsibility. As Rabbi Heschel, who's a philosopher, theologian, biblical interpreter, really just kind of an all-arounder, brilliant guy, he has this book about biblical prophecy where he talks about responsibility. And his idea there, and I think he sums it up best, is few are guilty, all are responsible. If I in any way benefit from or contribute to a society, I'm responsible for all of the wrongdoing done in that society. When it comes to science, I benefit from scientific research. I benefit from the products of science. A lot of that is unethical. The prime example I always use is the cell phone, right? Because these little bricks seem pretty ethically clean when they get to us. But if you do just a small amount of research into where your phone comes from and how it's made, there's a lot going on there. We know a lot about, say, where it's assembled. The factories are places where people are not often safe, where they're not often paid a living wage, where their bodies become permanently damaged assembling our cell phones. But it goes further than that. The plastics in it are petroleum products. That's oil. That contributes to climate change. Then there's the metals in there. There's a metal in cell phones and computers and every other form of digital technology called coltan. And coltan is primarily mined in the Congo in Africa. And it has mostly been mined by slaves and children. And so by the time it gets to you, you are benefiting from the products of slavery. What responsibility do you bear for that? I don't know, but I think it's probably some. What responsibility do I have to the planet for the use of my car? If I stopped driving to the grocery store, would that absolve me? If I sold my car completely? Well, maybe not, right? Because even if you just walk or bike there, how do those products get to your grocery store? Well, they come in trucks, and they usually come from across the country or even across the planet in some cases. So these are not just questions for those who are doing science, if science is indeed a verb. Yeah. Another question we might want to ask is, what is considered too sacred to be studied scientifically? And how do we make sure we don't ruin that sacredness through study? Something I would highlight here, and I can link to a book on it in the stuff on Canvas, is some controversies over the Human Genome Project and cultural heritages, particularly with indigenous communities. The Human Genome Project was done mostly by people who are pretty anti-racist, and they were trying to use it as a way to fight racism. However, they did not think completely about the way that their research was done. And there were many indigenous communities who said, hold on, the way that you're trying to map the story of humanity is an erasure of our cultural narratives of where we came from, an erasure of our origin stories. And so that becomes a fascinating ethical question. How do we do science? How do we measure things in a way that doesn't destroy narratives that cultures have for themselves? Another thing that we can talk about is responses. And this is in our Briggle and Mitchum text. We didn't talk about it last week. So a way that we can respond to unethical science is through legislation and government oversight, right? You know, we have ethics committees in our representative government here in the United States, but there's also governing bodies within universities. There's governing bodies within various organizations for scientists. But then there's a couple international ones, like the Nuremberg Ethics Code, which we'll check out here. So this comes to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and there's 10 points to it. And something you might notice is that almost all of them deal in research on human subjects, because of course the people being tried at Nuremberg did unethical research on human subjects that would really just be considered unnecessary and really just torture these days. Not a lot was actually learned in these experiments. And so rule number 1, voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And then rule number 2, these experiments need to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study. Yeah, they don't need to be unnecessary in nature. That's very important. Pop back into the PowerPoint here. I will put that link in Canvas, by the way. Then there's other things that have been done, like these commissions and handbooks that have been talked about in our chapter. The book On Being a Scientist goes into ways that science should be done. What is the way that scientists should conduct themselves? I think that's probably a very helpful text. Then there's this Responsible Science Committee. And another really interesting idea is rewarding ethical science with grants and prizes and money. Make sure that people who are doing the best are being paid the best. And this has not always worked out perfectly well in principle. Our textbook details a couple ways in which some folks have not been credited for their research, or other people have gotten prizes for research they stole. And maybe that's just part of living in a free society. Certainly the Nobel Committee could have done better. But as a principle, I think that idea works pretty well. Still, there's kind of a problem. Where does the average citizen fit in? Ethics in science is, and I want to emphasize this, not just for scientists. When all of us benefit from a great deal of science, when science is in some way the thing that governs our lives, especially right now where so much is done digitally. You know, a good deal of science here, ethical or unethical, is sort of out of the public view. And there's two ways that it is out of the public view. One way is that it's hidden, right? The Manhattan Project and MK Ultra and other studies are, well, they were kept secret, right? We know about them after the fact. But then there's other ways in which they're kept out of the public view, even if they are, open to the world. They're not really. Like, a year's subscription to Nature costs $199, and even if you forked out $200 so that you could read this scientific journal, it's written in jargon. I'll be honest, I'm pretty well educated, and I would probably not make it very deep into the average issue of Nature. Another problem there is that unethical practices are often hidden or kept elsewhere. And it's the cell phone problem again, right? By the time it gets to you, it's in a nice, shiny white box. It looks perfectly innocent because all of the injustice and unethical practices are exported. So, what do we do? In that TED talk I had you watch, the speaker says we need clarity. We need to get to the top of that mountain so we can see farther. And he lists these 5 hindrances, which are sensual desire, ill will or aversion, dullness or heaviness, restlessness, and skeptical doubt. And I think those are really good, hindrances. I think also that other cultural or philosophical or religious systems are going to have their own hindrances. But the real principle I want to pull out of here is this idea that you have to climb the mountain yourself, right? At some point, ethics becomes a journey of our own as individuals, as cultures, as communities, as families. However you want to slice it, that journey still needs to be taken. And sometimes that journey goes against the norms or even the rules around us. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But this concept of aligning ourselves with the goal, in this case, the goal is ethics, is, I would suggest, not just a Buddhist practice, but one that transcends cultures. We will talk sometime in the next couple weeks about Aristotelian virtue ethics, just sort of as an introduction to ethics. And Aristotle lists these virtues, and these are things that we should aspire to, we should work towards, we should push our friends towards. That's not ethics in terms of boundaries, that's ethics in terms of goals. Soren Kierkegaard, very great philosopher, wrote a book called Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. It's one of his religious works. And what he says there is, how do we have a pure heart? Well, we will one thing. What do we will? The good. And he goes into all these ways in which we do not will the good. He has his own list of hindrances in that book. Yeah, pause for water here. From that Thomas Merton piece, what I want to highlight here is ways that our sense of what is valued might be misjudged or conflated or conflicting. He was writing about how everyone was so shocked at what the Nazis could accomplish because the assumption was that they were insane. And they weren't insane. They were quite mentally well, and yet they accomplished such evil things. And so what's the problem there? Well, the problem is the valuing of sanity over justice. Instead of valuing ethics, there's a value of efficiency, of cleanliness. So, how do we align ourselves? Well, first, we need to find out what to be aligned with. Do we value efficiency or do we value ethics? Do we value justice or peace? Do we value comfort or doing the right thing? Do we value freedom or security? And those are not easy questions to ask, mostly because we often find that we've been valuing the wrong thing. There's also a question of context, and I will drop a video into Canvas for this. It's totally optional, where a guy is making a point about how context matters for morality using current news. I'm recording this lecture the Friday before classes go up. I recorded the last lecture on Wednesday, which was the day that the Capitol was sieged. And his point is, what you're protesting matters, and how the people who sieged the Capitol were not protesters, they were insurrectionists, and the context of what they're doing matters. In another case, and this is one of the cases he uses, it's wrong for someone to cut your front door down with an axe unless that person is a firefighter and your house is burning, in which case they're saving your life. They're acting perfectly ethically, right? A final thought. How do boundaries and rules work? How effective are rules? Are boundaries the best way to think about ethics? Not to say that boundaries are unimportant, but the boundaries we have don't really inspire us to do the right thing, right? They stop us from doing the wrong thing. And that's only if the boundaries themselves are ethical. The person I have on the side of the screen here, her name is Dorothy Day. She passed away a while ago, a long while ago, actually. But she's a pretty famous anti-war activist. She is the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement and had a long history of civil disobedience. And the way the Catholic worker practiced civil disobedience was fairly kind and fairly tame. They made a spectacle, and in doing so, pointed out the flaws of what they were protesting. I have a couple favorite examples. One was that they refused to pay their taxes as a community because they didn't want their money going to the military. They were peace activists. Another thing they did was they got arrested for having a pizza party because what they did was during a nuclear bomb air raid test, they got together and ate pizza in a park when everybody was supposed to be sheltering under their desks. And the news story about young people get arrested for eating pizza on a nice day ended up really highlighting kind of the absurdity of the nuclear arms race. She also was pretty famous for, as an old woman, going and handcuffing herself to various desks of government officials because that way she could get them to listen to her. And the optics of hauling an 80-something-year-old woman out of your office in handcuffs would look much worse than just sitting and listening to what she had to say. She was smart, but she also broke a lot of rules, and she did so because of her sense of ethics. So the question is, what do we do when the boundaries are unethical? What do we do when we need to focus more on doing good rather than avoiding wrong? And that's a very important question. Obviously, boundaries are important, and we can set up ethical boundaries, but following the rules is not itself ethics. Readings for next week. This is some pretty simple stuff. I want you to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail. If you haven't read it before, it is one of the finest pieces of American literature ever written. It's an incredible work. All of Dr. King's writing is great, actually. If you read this and feel inspired to read more, I would recommend his book Stride Toward Freedom, where he details the Montgomery bus boycott. I would also say, well, I wouldn't say you have to read Briggle and Mitchum's second chapter, Ethical Concepts and Theories, and I will have 2 lectures for you next week. I'm going to keep those short. They're going to be about 15, 20 minutes each, as to not overwhelm you with content. Also because I tend to breeze through content pretty quickly. There is also going to be a quiz at the end of this module that'll be due at the end of the first week of the next module. I will put it up as soon as it's done. It should be done pretty soon. Then we have discussion post number 2. This is due on January 2nd, which is a Friday at 11:59 p.m. Here are the questions I want you to answer. What are the average citizen's ethical responsibilities regarding science and technology? What about people in your chosen or hopeful profession? Like using myself as an example, right? My ethical responsibilities around science and technology are going to be pretty different when I'm teaching a class on ethics and science than when I was working as a camp director, right? Those are very different roles in society. They interact with very different groups of people. I'm working with adults now. I was working with children then. The way in which I might have a responsibility for science and technology is different. Another question you need to consider and write an answer for is what should be emphasized, avoiding wrong or doing good. And then not just to say, I want to say we need to focus on avoiding wrong because the wrong is worse and whatever. You also need to write how. How do we do this? How do we emphasize doing good, or how do we emphasize avoiding wrong? As always, these need to be 250 words or more. It's perfectly fine to go over. I'm going to read all of it anyway. One reply to appear. It needs to have substance. Remember, that is the one with 2 points, so make sure it has substance. And I need one citation from the readings for this week. Those are the things that are always required. Other than that, I think this was probably a pretty short lecture. Thank you all for joining me for all of this. Please give me any questions you might have via email or over a Canvas message. Thank you all for coming to watch this. I hope you all are staying safe and having a great day. And yeah, these videos are only going to get better as time goes on. Thank you and see ya.